Well, this is our guy Sean Stiers from Irish Breakdown and the Notre Dame Radio Network. And Sean, the reason we got you on to talk Notre Dame is there's a game coming up in November, but I guess that's more B. Notre Dame's quarterback is here now in Steve Angeli. So take us back, I'd say, first to the night where maybe most of the country met Steve, which was the college football semifinals when he came in for an injured Riley Leonard. Let's go then to now. What was that night like, and how did we get to where we're at, where he entered the portal and ended up in Syracuse?
Yeah, I think that night that you're talking about, the college football playoff semifinal against Penn State down in the Orange Bowl, and that's kind of where I think a little bit of the legend of Steve Angeli was born, especially for Notre Dame fans. It was the end of the first half, getting close to the end of the first half, and Notre Dame hadn't been able to score against Penn State all half. Riley Leonard took a hit, of course, the starting quarterback, and he had to leave the game, went into concussion protocol. He would ultimately come back to play the second half, but so Leonard goes to the sideline. Steve Angeli comes in, and Notre Dame, he proceeds to lead Notre Dame down the field into field goal range, and ultimately, would kick the field goal for the first points of the game. And in a game that was decided by a game-winning field goal on the in the final seconds of the game, it turned out to be pretty crucial. Now, in terms of passing, he wasn't perfect, but he was really good. He hit, I think it was 6 of 8 on that drive. He did take a couple of sacks. The second play of the series, he drops back to pass, and a strip sack by Penn State. And, Abdul Carter, who ultimately just went number 3 in the NFL draft to the Giants last weekend, was down at the bottom of a pile, and he had an injured shoulder. He was playing, hurt in that game. And if a couple of Notre Dame offensive linemen hadn't been able to wrestle the ball away from him at the bottom of that scrum, might have been a little bit different story that we're singing right now. But, they did yank it away from him. Angeli leads the offense downfield. He took another sack by Abdul Carter on the last offensive play before the field goal. But again, 3 big points for Notre Dame. And so that's kind of where, when that happened, because it's the second most extensive playing time that Angeli's got after the Sun Bowl a couple years prior to that. He started in the Sun Bowl after Drew Pine transferred. But, because of that experience and, that specific leading and the importance of that drive, I think a lot of people kind of assumed that Steve Angeli assumed or presumed that he was going to be the starting quarterback, in 2025. But as it turned out, there were a couple younger, really talented guys nipping at his heels, and they had a 3-man quarterback competition this spring. C.J. Carr, who's a redshirt freshman, Kenny Minchie, who's a redshirt junior, and ultimately those 2 guys are, what's left now of the quarterback competition after Angeli hit the transfer portal and obviously ultimately signed with Syracuse last week.
And Sean, I mean, you look at it, you don't hop in the portal, right, if you're winning the quarterback competition like that.
Exactly.
That's not the way that goes. How close was it? C.J. Carr is obviously like the very highly regarded young hotshot from a year and a half ago, major recruit for the Irish. I think, what was he, the number 2 quarterback in that class? How close was it when you look at this, and maybe what held Angeli back from winning that job this spring?
It's we only got 2 real opportunities. When I say we, I'm talking about the media, to see any of these guys do anything live. We had a handful of the 5-period practices where we get to see them, stretch and throw a few, passes, to receivers with no defenders and that kind of stuff. The week before the Blue Gold game, we got to see a controlled live scrimmage where we got to see all 3 quarterbacks, and then, of course, we got the Blue Gold game where it was fully live, 1s versus 1s, 2s versus 2s, 3, that kind of thing, where we got to see them all out there again. It was, in terms of just the ability to execute the offense, like Steve Angeli did just fine. But it was very clear that the two younger guys were the more talented. They had the bigger arms, those kind of things. They ultimately were able to make more plays. Like Steve Angeli was not, he was not erratic. He didn't throw any interceptions, nothing like that. But it was, like from a pure arm strength, arm talent standpoint, it was just obvious that C.J. Carr and Kenny Minchey were ahead of Steve Angeli. So, like, when you talk about how close it was, Marcus Freeman has never, really gone into detail about, what he feels like. And we've had the chance to talk to Freeman twice since the spring was over. And, the second time was after Angeli actually announced, that he was going into the portal. But he's never really differentiated what to him set it apart. He had just talked about the fact, well, you want to go into the spring, with a two-man competition and not a three-man competition. That's ultimately what they got. It just really felt to me, like Steve Angeli was just a touch here and there, like a pass, a few more passes high and incomplete, those kind of things. And there were a couple times where he was on target, but the throw was just a little bit behind, his receivers. Whereas a guy like C.J. Carr, especially like the way Carr throws the ball, it's much more, there's a lot more lead, the ability to throw guys open, those kind of things. So, ultimately it just like those kind of things. And what Marcus Freeman said was what we saw in the blue gold game was an indication of what they saw over the entire course of the spring. And so it felt like if that was truly the case, then it just became obvious that, with those little things in play, that guys like Carr and Minchey were ahead of Steve.
We got our guy Sean Stiers with us from IrishBreakdown.com, and heck, I'm sure you know it there at Notre Dame. You're coming off a year with Riley Leonard, where what a consummate college player he was. We're coming off the year here with Kyle McCord, who, as talented as he was, and that was evident, there was just some kind of quiet confidence about him that you knew the whole team would follow anything that he did. Well, where does Angeli kind of fit on that scale as being able to, grab hold of a football team and, be that QB leader, the stereotypical guy that you think about?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the one thing that really stands out about Steve Angeli is like the intangibles are there, like the leadership traits, they're there. And, like I think that maybe if there was anything that might have made this a tough call, like if you weren't just going on what you saw on the field, like those things are definitely work in Steve Angeli's favor. He's a leader. He's carried himself. Like coming into the spring, we talked to Gino Guidugli, the Notre Dame quarterback coach, about kind of what Steve's mindset was coming into the spring, knowing that he's in a three-man competition. And he said the one thing that you can always count on with Steve is like he believes, like he believes in himself. And I think a lot of guys gravitate toward that. Like he came into the spring with the mindset it was his job to lose, like it was his job all along. And I mean, obviously, ultimately it didn't work out that way, but guys believe in Steve. He is a great locker room guy. When he was still in high school, when he was part of, when Brian Kelly was still here, he committed to Brian Kelly out of high school, out of Don Bosco Prep out there in New Jersey. And, he was the kind of guy who was out there kind of beating the drum for Notre Dame, trying to get more guys to commit in that incoming recruiting class and that kind of thing. So from a pure leadership standpoint, I think that is front and center with Steve.
Yeah, I mean, we know all these guys want to start, right? Like that's
right.
What leads to everything we're seeing right now in this late portal window. We know Ricky Collins wants to start, who came here from LSU. We know the two guys going at it at Notre Dame want to start. Like that's no duh, right? All right, like we don't know what's going to happen with the Syracuse quarterback job yet. Let's say Steve doesn't win the quarterback job because we don't know what's going on. Now you've transferred, right? Like that's a tough spot to be in. How do you think he'd handle a spot like that? Now we're asking you really to speculate. How would he handle if he comes to Syracuse and maybe say opens the season in that Tennessee game, not being the guy taking the snap?
I mean, it's a legit question, and it's like, let's put it this way: the last 2 years he's taken the back seat. First to Sam Hartman, who transferred to Notre Dame from Wake Forest, and then obviously last year behind Riley Leonard. I think in both cases, like he could say, okay, I'm willing to do my time, get my experience and the whole thing with the big picture still in mind that coming into this season, he's still got 2 years of eligibility. left. Well, like as you said, guys want to play. So, and I'm not going to jump into Steve Angeli's head by any means, but it is a legit thing to say, look, I just transferred here. I lost, if this happens, I just transferred here. I lost the job. I wouldn't put it past a guy to say, well, I'm going to shut it down, just like Kelly Bryant at Clemson a few years back. We've seen some of these other, Notre Dame had a guy do it, defensive back last year. Jaden Mickey shut himself down after 4 games. He kept his eligibility and hit the transfer portal, So again, like it's hard to assume what Steve Angeli would or wouldn't do, but I wouldn't begrudge a guy, and it's not completely unprecedented that maybe he would want to hit the transfer portal again and look for another opportunity and keep both of those years of eligibility.
We were actually there when Kelly Bryant shut it down. Syracuse was their first game after that down in Clemson.
That's right.
It was Trevor Lawrence's first career start. They knocked him out of the game in the opening quarter, and Syracuse should have, could have won that one of Clemson's national title. So it'll be fascinating. Fascinating to watch because who the heck knows in this day and age
I know.
Of portal and whatnot. And for all we know, right, like, heck, Steve could lose the job, and then come November 22nd when the Orange are in South Bend, like he could be the starter. Like there is a legitimate possibility Syracuse plays Notre Dame each of the next 2 years. It could also play out, right, that Steve starts 2 career games against his old team.
That is very true. That is very true. And, look, it is football, and you just never know what happens. Like Notre Dame on its way to playing in a national championship game had a slew of guys, who went down to injury. As it turned out, only that one there was like that one moment in the Orange Bowl. There was one other moment for Riley Leonard against Louisville where he got knocked out for a play or two, and Angeli came, but Leonard came back in. But my point is, there's obviously, always the possibility that the other guy ends up with considerable playing time as well, just because a 12-game season is a long season.
All right, Sean, last thing before I let you go. You mentioned Sam Hartman there. How weird was it on a scale of 1 to 10? The dude was walking around with his rib on a necklace all season long.
I mean, it came up a time or two.
Just a time or two, right? Just a time. What a weird story that was. God bless him.
Very odd.
Golden locks out there.
Very odd. Yeah. So we went from Sam Hartman with the rib piece, from the surgery, to Riley Leonard and his mom. You suck and all. I don't know if you saw, that thing. His mom used to tell him he sucked before he became apparently to motivate him. So
hey, being Notre Dame quarterback's not for everybody.
That's right.
There's a lot that goes into
That's
that.
right.
Okay. All right, Sean. Always great to chat. I'm sure we'll catch up again as we get closer to Cuse and the Irish in November, but thanks for a little heads up on the new Orange quarterback in Steve Angeli.
Absolutely. Always good to talk to you. Thanks, Brian.